October 12, 1945, Camp Crossroads, Oklahoma. Behind the barbed wire, German prisoners arrived expecting chains, hard labor, and revenge for their role in a war that had killed millions. Instead, American intelligence officers placed blueprints in front of them and asked a simple question: can you build this? What the women revealed in those first weeks would force American military leadership to confront an uncomfortable truth. The enemy they'd defeated had been building weapons systems decades ahead of anything Allied engineers had imagined. One demonstration would prove these women weren't just prisoners making empty boasts. When that anti-aircraft gun fired for the first time on an Oklahoma testing range, the shell reached altitudes no American weapon could achieve, and every officer watching suddenly understood why so many bombers had never come home. These weren't ordinary POWs. They were the minds behind Germany's most advanced military technology, and they had knowledge that could change everything about how America approached the coming Cold War. But there was one problem nobody wanted to discuss. To gain that knowledge, America would have to forgive the unforgivable, to employ people who'd served evil, to transform enemies into colleagues. What happened next would challenge every assumption about loyalty, redemption, and whether technical expertise could ever be separated from the purposes it had served. October 12, 1945. Camp Crossroads, Oklahoma. The convoy of 6 covered trucks rolled through the main gates, just as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the Oklahoma sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for the grim cargo they carried. Private First Class Danny Morrison stood at his guard post, rifle slung over his shoulder, watching as each truck passed through the checkpoint with its load of German prisoners. But these weren't the battle-hardened soldiers he'd been expecting. Through the gaps in the canvas coverings, he caught glimpses of faces that shocked him, women in tattered Wehrmacht uniforms, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear, their hands gripping the wooden benches inside the trucks with white-knuckled intensity. He'd been stationed at Camp Crossroads for 8 months now, ever since taking shrapnel in his leg during the Battle of the Bulge and getting reassigned to stateside duty, and in all that time he'd processed hundreds of German POWs, but never women, never engineers, never anyone who looked quite as terrified as these prisoners did. As they rolled past his post into the wire-enclosed compound, the camp itself sprawled across 40 acres of flat Oklahoma prairie, a grid of wooden barracks surrounded by double rows of barbed wire fence, with guard towers positioned at each corner, and searchlights that swept the grounds after dark, and Morrison had always thought of it as relatively humane as far as POW camps went, certainly nothing like the horror stories coming out of the camps the Germans had run. The trucks came to a halt in the central assembly area, their brakes squealing in the evening quiet, and Captain Robert Hutchins emerged from the administration building, his uniform crisp despite the October heat that still lingered in the air. His face showing the same surprise Morrison felt at the sight of female prisoners. The back of the first truck dropped open with a metallic clang, and a woman in her mid-30s stepped down, her Wehrmacht Engineering Corps insignia still visible on her collar despite the dirt and wet, her short dark hair matted with sweat, her eyes scanning the camp with the calculating gaze of someone trained to assess structural weaknesses and defensive position. Behind her came more women, some young, barely out of their teens, others older, in their 40s or even 50s, all wearing the same exhausted expressions, all moving with the careful deliberation of people who expected violence at any moment. Morrison watched as they formed into ragged line, their military training still evident in how they stood at attention despite their exhaustion, and he found himself wondering what kind of war had produced this, what kind of desperate situation had led Germany to put women in engineering battalions, to teach them to build the massive fortifications and weapon systems that had held off Allied advances for so long. Captain Hutchins addressed them through an interpreter, a young lieutenant named Peters who'd grown up speaking German with his immigrant grandparents, explaining the camp rule, the work assignments, the daily routine. But Morrison could see the prisoners weren't really listening. They were looking past the captain, past the guards, toward the mess hall where smoke was rising from the kitchen chimney, where the smell of cooking meat was drifting across the compound on the evening breeze. The camp cook, a barrel-chested sergeant named Williams who'd worked in his family's barbecue restaurant before the war, had been preparing for their arrival all afternoon, and Morrison knew what was coming, knew that these women were about to experience something that would challenge every piece of propaganda they'd been fed about American brutality and primitive culture. The sun dropped lower, the shadows lengthening across the compound, and Morrison shifted his weight, his leg aching where the shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone 16 months earlier, watching as the prisoners were led toward the barracks that would house them, past the machine shops and workshops where they'd be assigned to work on agricultural equipment and construction projects, past the recreation yard where other German prisoners played volleyball and read letters from home, past all the ordinary sights of a POW camp that probably looked nothing like what they'd expected. The woman with the engineering insignia, the one who'd stepped down first, kept her head, her shoulders back, maintaining her dignity even in defeat, and Morrison recognized that look, had seen it in the mirror after his own injury had ended his combat service, that determination not to let circumstances break you. The trucks pulled away empty, heading back toward the train depot where they'd picked up their cargo, leaving behind 63 women who represented some of the German military's most skilled technical personnel, women who'd helped design and build the massive 88mm anti-aircraft guns that had terrorized Allied bombers, the concrete bunkers that had withstood artillery bombardment, the sophisticated range-finding equipment that had made German anti-aircraft fire so deadly, and Morrison wondered what stories they carried, what they'd seen, what they'd done in service of a regime that had brought such devastation to the world. As darkness settled over Camp Crossroads, the searchlights began their nightly sweep, and Morrison heard the dinner bell ring across the compound, heard Sergeant Williams shouting orders to his kitchen crew, heard the ordinary sounds of camp life continuing despite the extraordinary nature of these new arrivals, and he knew that something significant was about to unfold, something that would challenge assumptions on both sides of the barbed wire, though he couldn't have imagined then just how profound that challenge would become. 18 months after arriving at Camp Crossroads, the engineer stood in front of a classroom at Oklahoma State University, facing 23 engineering students who'd signed up for an advanced course in ballistics and weapons design, and Morrison sat in the back row, having enrolled in university on the GI Bill after his discharge from the Army, curious about whether the woman who'd taught him to see beyond his assumptions could teach him actual engineering principles as well. She'd received her immigration approval 6 months earlier, had been granted permanent residency with a path to citizenship, had been offered a teaching position in the engineering department specifically because of her expertise in areas where American universities were trying to catch up to wartime advances, and she'd accepted with the understanding that she would also continue consulting work for military intelligence on a part-time basis, maintaining her value to the institutions that had sponsored her immigration while building a legitimate academic career. Her son had been released from Soviet custody 3 months earlier, part of a prisoner exchange negotiated through channels that nobody had fully explained to her, and he was living with her in a small apartment near campus, attending high school and learning English and trying to adjust to life in a country that had recently been his enemy, and Morrison had met him once, a quiet teenager, who carried his own complicated relationship with the war and its aftermath. The engineer began her lecture with the fundamental principles of projectile motion, the physics that governed how objects moved through air, the calculations required to predict where a shell would be at any given point in its trajectory, the factors that affected accuracy and range and terminal velocity, and Morrison found himself fascinated by how she could take complex mathematics and make them comprehensible through clear explanation and practical examples, how she could connect abstract theory to concrete application. Some students knew about her background, about her wartime service designing weapons for Nazi Germany, and Morrison saw how they watched her with a mixture of fascination and moral uncertainty, trying to reconcile their respect for her obvious expertise with their discomfort about how that expertise had been developed and employed, and he recognized that tension because he felt it himself, had been feeling it for months as he'd watched the engineer transform from enemy prisoner to valued consultant to respected professor. She addressed the issue directly in her third lecture, acknowledging that the weapons systems she'd described throughout the course had been designed to kill Allied airmen, that the knowledge she was sharing had been developed in service of an evil regime, that technical expertise could be used for terrible purposes as easily as beneficial ones, and that every engineer had to grapple with the ethical implications of what they created, because tools were never truly neutral, because design choices had consequences, because claiming to be just an engineer was a form of moral evasion, that she would not allow herself or her students to indulge. Morrison saw several students nodding at this, saw them appreciating her honesty about the complications rather than trying to pretend the past didn't matter, and he realized this was perhaps the most valuable thing she could teach them, not the mathematics of ballistics or the principles of weapon design, but the recognition that technical work existed within moral frameworks that couldn't be ignored. The semester continued, and Morrison found himself staying after class sometimes to ask questions, not just about engineering but about how the engineer had made sense of her experiences, how she reconciled her pride in technical achievement with her shame about what those achievements had served, how she thought about the bombers she'd helped shoot down, and the families those crews had left behind, and she never gave easy answers, always acknowledging the complexity, always refusing to reduce moral questions to simple formulas. Pete, who'd left the army and enrolled at the same university, mentioned that the engineer was becoming popular among students who appreciated her demanding standards and her refusal to accept mediocre work, that she was developing a reputation as the toughest professor in the engineering department, but also the most knowledgeable, and that applications for her advanced courses were exceeding available spaces, forcing the department to create additional sections to meet demand. Morrison passed his courses with better grades than he'd expected, discovered that he actually enjoyed the systematic problem-solving that engineering required, and began thinking about a career in aerospace design, about working on civilian applications of the principles he was learning, about using technical knowledge to build rather than destroy, and he recognized how the engineer's influence had shaped this decision, how her example of trying to redeem a complicated past through productive present work had affected his thinking about what kind of life he wanted to build. The engineer's son graduated high school and enrolled at the same university, choosing to study medicine rather than engineering, explaining to Morrison one day that he wanted to spend his life saving people rather than designing systems that might harm them. And Morrison saw how the younger generation was trying to create distance from their parents' wars while carrying the burden of that history forward. 3 years after the engineer had arrived at Camp Crossroads as a prisoner, expecting chains and punishment, Morrison attended a ceremony where she received tenure at the university, formal recognition that her contributions to the engineering program were valuable enough to warrant permanent employment. He watched her accept the honor with the same careful composure she'd maintained throughout her transformation from enemy to colleague, thanking her department chair and acknowledging her students and expressing hope that she could continue contributing to engineering education and research for years to come. Morrison approached her after the ceremony, congratulated her on the achievement, mentioned that he'd be graduating next semester with a degree in mechanical engineering, and she smiled with genuine pleasure, saying that she was proud of all her students, but especially those who'd started their academic journey from unexpected places, and he understood she was acknowledging their shared history, the strange path that had brought a German weapons designer and an American guard into a relationship of teacher and student. The world was rebuilding itself after the war's devastation, and people like the engineer were finding places in that reconstruction, using their expertise in new contexts, trying to balance the weight of what they'd done with the possibility of what they might still contribute, living with complexity, rather than seeking simple absolution. And Morrison recognized that this messy, complicated process of moving forward was perhaps the best anyone could hope for after years of violence and destruction had rearranged millions of lives. The mess hall at Camp Crossroads had been built to feed 300 prisoners, a long wooden structure with windows running along both sides, and industrial kitchen equipment that Sergeant Williams maintained with religious devotion, treating his cast-iron skillets and deep fryers with the same care other men gave their weapons, and tonight the building felt cavernous with only 63 women seated at the long tables, their posture stiff, their movements cautious, their eyes constantly darting toward the doors and the armed guards who stood at casual attention along the walls. Morrison had drawn interior guard duty for the evening, which meant standing in the mess hall corner watching the prisoners eat, and he could feel the tension radiating from them like heat from a stove, could see how their hands trembled slightly as they sat waiting for whatever meager rations they assumed would be thrown at them, and he wondered what they'd been told about American prison camps, what horror stories Nazi propaganda had fed them about the fate awaiting captured German soldiers. The kitchen doors swung open, and Williams emerged carrying the first tray, his white apron already stained with grease and flour, his face showing the satisfaction of a man who took pride in his work, and Morrison watched the prisoners' reactions as the sergeant began placing metal plates in front of them, watched their expressions shift from fear to confusion to complete disbelief. On each plate sat 3 pieces of golden brown fried chicken, the coating crispy and glistening with moisture, alongside a mound of mashed potatoes with butter melting into a pool on top, a scoop of green beans seasoned with bacon, and 2 buttermilk biscuits that were still steaming from the oven. And Morrison saw the woman with the engineering insignia, the one they'd started calling the engineer among the guards, stare at her plate as if it might explode. Williams and his crew moved through the mess hall with efficient precision, placing identical plates in front of each prisoner. And Morrison noticed how some of the younger women started crying silently, tears running down their faces as they looked at more food than they'd probably seen in months, maybe years, given how desperate conditions in Germany had become in the final months of the war. The engineer picked up her fork, her hand steady despite the shock evident in her eyes, and she cut a small piece from the chicken breast, brought it to her lips, paused for just a moment as if gathering courage, then placed it in her mouth, and Morrison watched her freeze mid-chew, watched her eyes go wide, watched something fundamental shift in her expression. The mess hall went completely silent except for the hum of the kitchen fans and the distant sound of other prisoners in the compound playing cards in their barracks, and every woman at those tables stopped whatever they were doing to watch the engineer, to see her reaction, to understand what this food meant, because they'd been trained to recognize traps, to suspect anything that seemed too good to be true, to question every kindness from an enemy who'd spent years trying to kill them. The engineer chewed slowly, swallowed, then looked down at her plate with an expression Morrison couldn't quite read, something between wonder and grief, between hunger and shame, and when she took another bite, when she started eating with genuine appetite, the dam broke and every woman in that mess hall began to eat, some slowly and carefully, others with the desperate speed of people who'd known real starvation, and the sound of forks scraping plates filled the space where silence had been. Morrison saw one woman in her 40s, her uniform bearing the insignia of a senior technical specialist, pick up a piece of chicken with her hands and bite into it, grease running down her fingers, her eyes closing in something that looked almost like prayer. And he realized this was the first time many of these prisoners had tasted fried chicken, had experienced what Williams called real American cooking, and the cultural shock of it was written across every face in the room. The younger women whispered to each other in German, their voices carrying just enough for Lieutenant Peters to hear and translate quietly for Captain Hutchins, who'd come to observe the first meal, and Morrison caught fragments of their conversation, disbelief that this was prison food, confusion about why their captors would feed them so well, fear that this abundance was temporary or came with strings attached, questions about whether the food was poisoned or drugged, though the visible presence of guards eating from the same kitchen clearly disproved that theory. Williams emerged from the kitchen again, this time carrying a tray of dessert, slices of apple pie with lattice crusts that had been cooling on the window sills, and when he started distributing them, Morrison saw the engineer actually laugh, a short, bitter sound that held years of propaganda colliding with present reality. The sound of someone whose entire worldview was being challenged by golden fried chicken and homemade pie. The meal lasted 45 minutes, and by the end, every plate was clean, every crumb of biscuit consumed, every trace of gravy mopped up, and the prisoners sat in a kind of stunned silence, their bellies full for probably the first time in months, their faces showing the complex emotions of people who'd been taught to expect brutality and received kindness instead, who'd been prepared for chains and starvation, and found themselves eating better than they had in the final years of the war in Germany. As the women filed out of the mess hall, escorted by guards toward their barracks for the night, Morrison heard one of them speaking to the engineer in rapid German, and Peters translated quietly, the young woman asking how they could reconcile what they'd been told about America with what they'd just experienced, asking whether the food was meant to soften them up for interrogation or forced labor, asking whether any of what they'd believed about their enemies could possibly be true, and the engineer responded with something that Peters translated as, "I don't know anymore, I just don't know." And Morrison understood that feeling perfectly, that sense of having your certainty stripped away by reality, that vertigo of discovering the world isn't what you thought it was. 3 days after the prisoners arrived, Captain Hutchins received orders from command to conduct a thorough inventory of all personal effects and materials that had been transported with the women from the processing center in New York, where they'd been held after crossing the Atlantic on a Liberty ship packed with POWs, and Morrison drew assignment to the detail responsible for cataloging everything in the storage building where the Germans' belongings had been secured pending security review. The building was a converted workshop on the eastern edge of the compound, its concrete floor stained with decades of oil and grease, its walls lined with shelves that now held the accumulated possessions of 63 women who'd traveled halfway around the world in defeat, and Morrison found himself going through crate after crate of ordinary items, uniforms, personal letters, photographs of families and sweethearts, the mundane debris of lives interrupted by war and capture. The engineer was assigned to the detail as well, along with 5 other prisoners, all under guard supervision, and Morrison watched her move through the space with that same calculating gaze he'd noticed on the first day, her eyes taking in the layout, the equipment, the structural features of the building with automatic professional assessment, and he wondered what she saw that he didn't, what her training revealed that his guard experience missed. They'd been working for about an hour, Morrison opening crates and checking contents against manifests while the engineer and the other prisoners sorted items under Lieutenant Peter's watchful eye, when one of the younger German women called out something urgent in her native language, her voice sharp with excitement or alarm. Morrison couldn't tell which. Peters moved quickly to where she was kneeling beside a large wooden crate that had been marked with red paint and stenciled German text that Morrison couldn't read, and when the lieutenant pried open the top and pulled out what was inside, Morrison saw his expression change from bored routine to intense focus in an instant. Inside the crate were rolled technical drawings, dozens of them, each one carefully preserved in waterproof wrapping, each one bearing official Wehrmacht stamps and classification marking, and when Peters unrolled the first one on a nearby workbench, Morrison moved closer to see what had captured the lieutenant's attention so completely. The drawing showed a massive anti-aircraft gun, its barrel nearly 20 feet long, its mounting system, a complex arrangement of hydraulics and gears, its ammunition feed mechanism, detailed in precise engineering notation, and even to Morrison's untrained eye, the weapon looked far more sophisticated than anything he'd seen during his time in combat, more advanced than the standard flak guns that had defended German cities against Allied bombing raids, more refined than the 88mm guns that had earned such fearsome reputations for their accuracy and power. The engineer had gone very still, her face carefully neutral, but Morrison saw tension in her shoulders, saw the way her hands clenched at her sides, and he realized this discovery meant something significant, something that went beyond simple inventory of prisoner possessions. Peters called for Captain Hutchins, and within minutes the workshop was filled with officers, including a major from intelligence who'd been visiting the camp to interview prisoners about German industrial capacity, and they spread out drawing after drawing on every available surface, revealing designs for not just the gun itself, but its ammunition, its targeting systems, its proposed mobile platform, its factory tooling requirements, everything needed to manufacture and deploy a weapon that had apparently never made it past the prototype stage. The major turned to the engineer's expression skeptical, his voice carrying the dismissive tone of someone who'd heard too many desperate stories from defeated enemies, trying to bargain for better treatment, and through Peters he asked whether this design was real, or just wishful thinking from engineers who'd been losing a war, whether Germany had actually built these weapons, or if they were just elaborate fantasies drawn up in the final desperate months before surrender. The engineer met his gaze directly, no longer showing the fear and exhaustion that had marked her arrival, and she spoke in carefully measured tones that Peters translated precisely, explaining that the weapon in the drawings had been built, tested and deployed in limited numbers during the final 6 months of the war, that she and the other women in this camp had been part of the engineering team responsible for its development, that what the Americans were looking at represented the culmination of 3 years of research and development conducted in underground facilities across Germany, while Allied bombs destroyed everything above ground. The major laughed, actually laughed, his skepticism deepening into outright disbelief, and Morrison saw other officers exchanging amused glances, saw them treating this claim as exactly what the major had suggested, desperate fiction from prisoners trying to make themselves seem important, trying to leverage imaginary expertise into better conditions, or early repatriation. Morrison had seen that reaction before, had witnessed how easy it was for victors to dismiss the defeated, how simple it was to assume that losing the war meant you'd never had anything valuable to begin with, and he watched the engineer's face harden, watched her pride overcome her caution, as she started speaking rapidly in German, her voice rising with anger or frustration. Peters struggled to keep up with the translation, but the essence came through clearly enough. The engineer explaining that the weapon had been designed specifically to counter the high-altitude bombing raids that had devastated German cities, that it could reach altitudes no existing anti-aircraft gun could achieve, that it had shot down dozens of American bombers in the brief period it had been deployed, that the women in this camp represented some of the most advanced weapons engineering expertise Germany had possessed, and that dismissing their work as fantasy was exactly the kind of arrogance that had cost the Allies thousands of lives they might have saved if they'd taken German technical capabilities more seriously. The workshop went silent after Peters finished translating, the officers staring at this middle-aged woman in a dirty POW uniform who'd just lectured them on military strategy and weapons design, and Morrison saw the Major's expression shift from amusement to something more complex, a mixture of anger at being challenged and grudging respect for someone who refused to be dismissed, and the tension in the room ratcheted up several notches, as everyone waited to see how he'd respond. The Major made a decision that surprised everyone in the workshop, including Morrison, who'd expected the officer to simply confiscate the drawings and dismiss the prisoner's claims as he'd clearly been inclined to do before the engineer's outburst challenged his assumptions. Instead, the Major announced that he wanted proof, wanted to see whether these women could actually do what they claimed, wanted a demonstration that would either validate their expertise or expose their boasts as empty propaganda. And within 24 hours, Camp Crossroads had transformed from a routine POW facility into something resembling an improvised weapons testing range. The camp had a disused firing range on its northern perimeter, an area that had been used for small arms training before the war and now sat abandoned, overgrown with prairie grass and scattered with the remnants of old target stands, and this became the site where the engineer and her team would either prove their capabilities or confirm the Major's skepticism about defeated enemies making grandiose claims they couldn't support. Morrison watched the preparations unfold with the fascination of someone witnessing history being made, even if that history was small and local and would probably never make it into any official record. And he saw how the engineer moved from defeated prisoner to confident engineer as soon as she had a technical problem to solve, her entire demeanor changing, her exhaustion falling away like a discarded coat. The women weren't going to build the actual gun from the drawing that would have taken months and resources the camp didn't have, but the Major had arranged for the delivery of a damaged German 88 Kreeft gun that had been captured during the advance through France, a weapon that had taken a direct hit from American artillery and been considered beyond repair by the ordnance experts who'd examined it, and the challenge was simple: if these women were the engineering experts they claimed to be, they could fix. Captain Hutchins had expressed reservations about giving enemy prisoners access to functional weapons, even under guard supervision, but the Major had overruled him, arguing that the gun would remain disabled until the final testing phase, that adequate security could be maintained, and that the potential intelligence value of confirming these women's technical capabilities outweighed the minimal risk of giving them tools and materials under constant armed supervision. The gun arrived on a flatbed truck just after dawn on the fourth day, its massive barrel scarred and bent from the artillery strike that had knocked it out of commission, its mechanical systems clearly damaged, its electrical firing controls a tangled mess of severed wires and shattered components. Morrison heard several of the guards muttering that this was impossible, that no amount of engineering skill could resurrect something that looked this thoroughly destroyed. The engineer walked around the gun slowly, her eyes moving over every inch of damaged metal, her hands reaching out to touch specific points, to test the movement of gears and mechanisms, to assess what was broken and what might be salvaged, and Morrison saw her speaking to the other prisoners in rapid German, saw them nodding, saw a plan taking shape in their shared technical language. Through Peters, the engineer requested tools and materials, a list that included welding equipment, precision measuring instruments, replacement electrical components, lubricants, cleaning supplies, and a dozen other items that the camp's maintenance shop could provide, and the Major approved everything, his skepticism still evident, but his curiosity clearly engaged. The women worked for 3 days straight, taking only brief breaks for meals and sleep, their hands moving with the confidence of people who'd done this kind of repair work hundreds of times before. And Morrison found himself watching the engineer in particular, noting how she directed the others, how she made decisions about which components to repair and which to replace, how she solved problems that arose with the calm assurance of genuine expertise. The younger women deferred to her judgment, calling her Frau Doktor in tones that suggested both respect and affection, and Peters explained that she'd been a professor of mechanical engineering before the war, had published papers on ballistics and material science, had been recruited into the Wehrmacht technical corps specifically for her expertise in weapon systems design. On the morning of the 7th day, the engineer announced through Peters that the gun was ready for testing, that they'd repaired the major damage and recalibrated the targeting system, that it should function as well as it had before the artillery strike had disabled it, and Morrison saw the Major's expression shift to something like anticipation mixed with dread, because if she was right, if these women had actually accomplished what trained American ordnance specialists had declared impossible, then every assumption about the defeated enemy would need reconsideration. The testing range was cleared, guards posted at safe distance, and the gun was loaded with a single round of the correct caliber ammunition that had been sourced from captured German stockpiles, and the engineer took her position at the gun's controls, her hands moving over the mechanisms with practiced ease. Her eyes focused on a target drone that had been launched from the camp's auxiliary field. Morrison stood with the other guards, watching through binoculars, as the engineer made adjustments to the gun's elevation and traverse. She calculated windage and range with instruments the prisoners had improvised from salvaged materials, as she prepared to fire a weapon that might explode in her face if their repairs had been inadequate, or might prove her claims beyond any doubt, if everything worked as intended. The target drone climbed toward its programmed altitude of 8,000 feet, a small speck against the October sky, and the engineer's hands moved to the firing controls, her whole body tensed with concentration, and Morrison held his breath along with everyone else on that firing range, waiting to see whether this moment would validate or demolish the claims these women had been making. The gun fired with a sound like thunder, a concussive boom that echoed across the Oklahoma prairie, and Morrison tracked the shell's trajectory through his binocular, watched it arc upward toward the distant drone, watched it come impossibly close, close enough that he knew the targeting calculations had been essentially perfect, and then the shell exploded in a cloud of black smoke just meters from the target, close enough that if it had been a real bomb or shrapnel would have torn it apart. The Major's skepticism evaporated the moment that shell exploded near its target, replaced by something Morrison recognized from his combat days, that mixture of respect and wariness you developed for an enemy who proved more capable than you'd assumed, who demonstrated skills and knowledge that challenged your comfortable sense of superiority. And within an hour of the successful test, the engineer was sitting in Captain Hutchins' office, with a translator, 3 intelligence officers, and a stenographer recording every word. Morrison wasn't present for that initial interview, but Peters told him later that the Major had started by apologizing, an unusual gesture from a senior officer to a prisoner, acknowledging that he'd dismissed her claims unfairly, that he'd allowed his prejudices about defeated enemies and female engineers to cloud his judgment, and asking whether she and her team would be willing to share their knowledge of German weapons development in exchange for certain considerations regarding their imprisonment conditions. The engineer had agreed, but on specific terms that showed she understood her sudden value as a technical resource. She wanted better working conditions for all the women in her group, access to books and technical journals, permission to correspond with family members in Germany, and most importantly, acknowledgement in any intelligence reports that the information came from her team specifically, not from anonymous captured documents or interrogations, because she wanted their expertise recognized and recorded for history. The Major had agreed to everything except the last point, explaining that intelligence protocols required protecting source identities, but he'd made a note in the file that would at least preserve their contribution in classified records, and with that understanding established, the engineer began describing a world of German weapons development that nobody in American intelligence had fully appreciated. She explained that the gun they'd repaired was obsolete by the standards of what her team had been working on in the final months of the war, that the designs in the captured drawings represented weapons systems far more advanced than anything the Allies had encountered in combat, that Germany's defeat had come not from lack of technical innovation, but from lack of resources, manufacturing capacity, and time to deploy the innovations they'd developed. Morrison heard pieces of this from Peters over the following days, as the lieutenant translated hours of technical discussions, and found himself fascinated by the picture emerging from the engineer's debrief. And what struck Morrison most was how matter-of-factly she described the weapons designed to kill American and British airmen. No moral anguish about the purpose of her work, just professional pride in solving difficult technical problems. She described a weapon called the Flak-Zwilling, a twin-barreled anti-aircraft gun that could fire shells to altitudes of 50,000 feet, well above the ceiling of any Allied bomber, with a rate of fire 3 times faster than conventional flak guns, and targeting systems that used early radar guidance to track aircraft through clouds and darkness, eliminating the visual limitations that had made nighttime bombing raids relatively safe for Allied crews. She described the ammunition they'd developed, shells with proximity fuses that detonated automatically when they came within lethal range of an aircraft, removing the need for the split-second timing that made traditional flak so ineffective, shells with fragmenting cases designed to maximize shrapnel spread, shells with incendiary components that could ignite fuel tanks and destroy bombers, even with near-miss explosions. She described the manufacturing challenges they'd faced, how the weapons required precision machining that Germany's bombed factories could barely provide, how they'd been forced to develop simplified designs that could be produced in underground facilities with limited tooling, how they'd trained unskilled labor, including other women, to perform complex assembly operations that would normally require years of apprenticeship. She described the testing program, how they'd deployed prototype guns to defend critical targets, how they'd refined the designs based on combat performance, how they'd documented every engagement to improve accuracy and reliability, and how the weapons had performed exactly as predicted when given adequate ammunition and skilled crews, shooting down bombers at rates that would have been devastating if the guns had been deployed in larger numbers earlier in the war. The major pressed her on specific points, trying to understand why these weapons hadn't appeared sooner, why Germany's technical advantages hadn't translated into battlefield success, and the engineer's answer was simple: logistics and time. The advanced weapons required rare materials that Allied bombing had made nearly impossible to source, required factory capacity that didn't exist after years of strategic bombing, required trained crews that couldn't be produced quickly enough as casualties mounted, and Germany's military collapsed. Morrison found himself thinking about the bombers that had been lost over Germany, about the crews who'd never returned from missions over Berlin and Hamburg and Dresden, and he wondered how many of them had been killed by these advanced weapons, how many might have survived if the engineers' guns had malfunctioned, or been less effectively designed, and that thought sat uncomfortably in his mind alongside his growing respect for her technical ability. Captain Hutchins called a meeting of all the guards who'd be interacting with the German prisoners, and he explained that intelligence had determined these women represented significant value as technical resources, that they were to be treated with appropriate respect, that any guard caught mistreating or insulting them would face disciplinary action, and Morrison saw how this order changed the dynamics in the camp, how the prisoners went from being defeated enemies to being something more complex, experts whose knowledge was suddenly valuable, people whose cooperation was worth ensuring through decent treatment. The engineer seemed to understand this shift perfectly, and Morrison watched her navigate the new reality with the same calculated precision she brought to engineering problems, maintaining her dignity while cooperating with her captors, protecting her team while sharing information, walking the line between collaboration and surrender with careful attention to where each step might lead. Peters mentioned that the Major had asked the engineer whether she felt any remorse about designing weapons to kill Allied airmen, and she'd responded that the airmen had been dropping bombs on German cities, killing civilians including children, that she'd considered it her patriotic duty to stop them, but that now the war was over, and she hoped both sides could learn from the technical innovations developed during the conflict, could use that knowledge for peaceful purposes rather than more efficient ways to kill each other. Morrison wasn't sure how he felt about that answer, whether it represented genuine hope for the future, or calculated positioning to make herself sympathetic to her captors, but he recognized the fundamental truth in it, that engineers on both sides had spent years developing better ways to destroy each other, and that maybe something useful could be salvaged from all that lethal innovation. The transformation of Camp Crossroads into an impromptu technical research facility happened gradually over the next 3 weeks, as word spread through military intelligence channels about the German engineering team and their specialized knowledge, and Morrison watched the camp's population shift to include American engineers, ordnance specialists, and technical officers who arrived with questions about weapons systems, manufacturing techniques, and design innovations they'd encountered in captured German equipment. The engineer became the central figure in this evolving operation, her expertise recognized not just by the major who'd first tested her claims, but by senior officers from ordnance commands across the country, and she negotiated each new request with the same careful attention to her team's conditions and recognition, ensuring that cooperation translated into tangible benefits for all the women under her informal leadership. Morrison found himself assigned to the expanded workshop area that had been cleared out and equipped with drafting tables, technical references, and manufacturing equipment sourced from nearby military installations, and his role shifted from simple guard duty to something more like facility security, watching over a space where former enemies worked together on problems that interested them both. The dynamic was strange at first, American engineers sitting alongside German prisoners, discussing ballistic coefficients and metallurgy and production tolerances through translators, but Morrison noticed how quickly technical language bridged the gap between victor and vanquished, how shared professional interests created common ground that politics and warfare had tried to destroy. One of the younger German women, barely 20 years old, had specialized in electrical systems for targeting mechanisms, and Morrison watched her explain to an American major how German engineers had developed early computational fire control systems that automatically calculated lead angles for moving targets, systems that anticipated by decades the computers that would eventually become standard in military hardware, and the major's expression shifted from condescension to genuine interest, as he realized she understood principles his own experts were still struggling to implement. The engineer spent hours at her drafting table, recreating from memory the detailed specifications for weapons that had never been fully documented before Germany's collapse, and American engineers crowded around her workspace watching how she approached design problems, asking questions about her methodology, taking notes on techniques that might be applicable to American weapons development. Morrison overheard one conversation where an American colonel asked the engineer how Germany had managed to develop such sophisticated weapons while losing the war, and her answer was blunt: they'd had better engineers than they had resources, better designs than they had factories, better ideas than they had time to implement, and the weapons that actually made it to production represented a small fraction of what her teams had conceived. She described projects that had never gotten past the drawing board: a jet-powered interceptor that could have reached altitudes where Allied bombers couldn't fly, an anti-aircraft rocket system with radar guidance that could have replaced traditional flak guns entirely, a mobile artillery piece that used magnetic acceleration instead of chemical propellants to achieve unprecedented range and accuracy, all designs that were theoretically sound but practically impossible, given Germany's collapsing industrial base. The colonel asked why she was sharing this information with her former enemies, and the engineer's response was pragmatic: the war was over, Germany was defeated, her government and military no longer existed, and she had a choice between letting years of research die with the Third Reich, or ensuring that knowledge survived for future engineers to build upon, and she'd chosen survival of the work over loyalty to a regime that had proven itself morally bankrupt. Morrison saw how this answer satisfied the American officers, how it allowed them to accept her cooperation without questioning whether they were collaborating with someone who might still harbor Nazi sympathy, and he wondered whether the engineer genuinely believed what she was saying or whether she was simply giving her captors the moral clarity they needed to work with her without guilt. The workshop became increasingly busy as more projects were added to the collaboration, American engineers bringing problems they were struggling with, and asking whether German research had addressed similar issues. The engineer and her team consulting on everything from ammunition design to factory tooling to quality control methodologies that could improve American manufacturing efficiency, and Morrison realized he was witnessing knowledge transfer on a scale that would have been unimaginable just weeks earlier. Peters mentioned that the engineer had started teaching informal classes in the evening, advanced engineering concepts that some of the American officers wanted to understand more deeply, and Morrison saw how education created relationships that transcended the prisoner-captor dynamic, how shared learning built mutual respect even between people who'd recently been trying to kill each other. The younger German women began to relax as the work continued, their initial fear replaced by the satisfaction of using their skills productively. And Morrison noticed how they started joking with the American engineers, how they shared stories about technical failures and successes from their wartime work, how the workshop developed its own culture that existed separate from the military hierarchy surrounding it. Captain Hutchins observed all this with bemused tolerance, commenting to Morrison that he'd never expected his POW camp to become a technical college, but acknowledging that the intelligence value of the collaboration probably justified the unusual arrangement. And Morrison saw how the captain's initial skepticism had transformed into something like pride at running a facility that was producing genuinely useful results. The engineer requested additional resources for a specific project, detailed analysis of American bomber defensive systems to explain how German anti-aircraft weapons had been optimized to defeat them, and the major approved the request despite obvious concerns about sharing classified information with enemy prisoners, arguing that the knowledge gained would outweigh any security risks. Morrison sat in on one session where the engineer explained to a room full of American officers how German targeting systems had exploited specific vulnerabilities in B-7, how they'd calculated optimal burst patterns for maximum effectiveness, how they'd trained crews to recognize and exploit the weaknesses in Allied defensive tactics, and he saw the officers taking notes with grim fascination, understanding how their own bombers had been systematically analyzed and targeted by an enemy who understood their capabilities better than they'd realized. 6 weeks after the German women arrived at Camp Crossroads, Morrison pulled night watch in the barracks area, walking the perimeter between the buildings where the prisoners slept, and through an open window he heard voices speaking in German, not the technical discussions he'd become accustomed to hearing during workshop hours, but something more personal, more emotional, and he paused in the shadows to listen, even though he knew he shouldn't, drawn by a tone in the conversation that suggested important things were being revealed. Peters was making his rounds as well, and Morrison flagged him down, asking him to translate what was being said, and the young lieutenant listened for a moment, then explained in a quiet voice that the women were talking about their families, about what they'd lost during the war, about what they'd learned since being captured, about the full extent of what Germany had done. The engineer's voice carried clearly through the night air, and Peters translated her words haltingly, emotional content being harder to convey than technical specifications, explaining that she'd received a letter from the Red Cross informing her that her husband had been killed in the final weeks of the war, that her son was in a Soviet prisoner camp with unknown prospects for release, that her daughter had died in the bombing of Dresden, and that her entire world had collapsed while she'd been focused on building better ways to shoot down the bombers that had destroyed her home. Morrison felt something twist in his chest hearing this, the recognition that the engineer wasn't just a technical resource or a defeated enemy, but a woman who'd lost everything, and he wondered how she'd managed to maintain her professional composure through all those hours of collaboration when her personal life had been demolished by the same war her weapons had been designed to prosecute. One of the younger women was speaking now, her voice choked with tears, and Peters explained that she'd learnt about the concentration camps, about the systematic murder of millions of people, about the reality of what the Nazi regime had done in the name of Germany, and was struggling to reconcile having served that regime with the horror of its crime, asking how they were supposed to live with having been part of something so evil. The engineer's response was measured and careful, acknowledging the terrible truth of what they'd learned, acknowledging that ignorance didn't excuse complicity, but arguing that they'd been engineers doing technical work, that they'd never participated directly in the atrocities, that they'd focused on military targets and hadn't known about the death camps until after the surrender, and Morrison heard the rationalization in her words, heard her trying to create moral distance between weapons development and genocide even though both had served the same regime. Another voice joined the conversation, an older woman who'd been quieter than most during the workshop sessions, and Peters translated her stark words, saying that intent didn't matter, results mattered. They'd helped prolong a war that had given the Nazi regime more time to murder more people. Their technical expertise had been a resource that Germany had exploited, just as surely as it had exploited the labor of concentration camp prisoners, and they would have to live with that knowledge for the rest of their lives. Morrison saw Peter's face in the moonlight, saw the young lieutenant struggling with the same moral complexities that these words raised, the recognition that technical work wasn't neutral, that engineering wasn't separate from politics, that every person who'd contributed skills to the war effort had to grapple with what their contributions had enabled. The conversation in the barracks shifted to what came next, what kind of lives they could build after being released, whether anyone in Germany would care about their technical expertise when the entire country was being rebuilt from rubble, whether they would face punishment for having served the Nazi military, whether they would ever be able to practice engineering again, or would be forced into manual labor as so many German women were doing in the occupied zones. The engineer spoke about responsibility and redemption, about how they couldn't undo what had been done, but could try to ensure their knowledge was used for better purposes in the future, about how cooperation with the Americans was a way of choosing which side of history they wanted to be on now that the immediate conflict was over, and Morrison heard her trying to create a narrative that would allow these women to live with themselves, to find meaning in their current work that might balance the scales against what their wartime work had contributed to. Peters whispered that he needed to keep moving on his route, that standing here listening felt like a violation of the prisoner's privacy, even though he understood Morrison's fascination with what was being revealed, and the two men continued their patrol, leaving the women to their conversation and their grief and their complicated reckoning with what they'd done, and what had been done in their names. Morrison couldn't sleep after his shift ended, lying in his bunk thinking about the engineer's losses, about the younger woman's tear, about the older woman's harsh truth, that intent didn't excuse results, and he found himself questioning his own assumptions about these prisoners, about whether technical competence deserved respect when it had been employed in service of evil, about whether collaboration now could redeem collaboration then. He thought about the bombers that had been lost, about the crews who'd never come home, and he tried to reconcile his respect for the engineer's abilities with his anger at what those abilities had been used for, and he couldn't find a clean answer, couldn't create moral clarity out of the messy reality of people who'd done both impressive technical work and terrible harm. Morning came, and the workshop routine resumed as if nothing had changed. The engineer at her drafting table explaining ballistic calculations to American engineers, the younger women working on electrical systems and manufacturing processes, everyone focused on technical problems as if personal tragedies and moral reckonings could be set aside during working hours, and Morrison realized this was how people survived, by compartmentalizing, by treating work as separate from conscience, by finding small areas of control in situations that felt overwhelmingly beyond any individual's power to affect. Captain Hutchins mentioned that intelligence was considering whether to extend the collaboration indefinitely, whether these women might be valuable enough to keep in American custody for years rather than months, whether their expertise could justify treating them not as prisoners but as technical consultants, whose work happened to be conducted under guard, and Morrison saw how bureaucracy was transforming defeat into employment, how the machinery of government could rationalize any arrangement that served institutional interests. Peters said, the engineer had asked about the possibility of emigrating to America after her release, of bringing whatever remained of her family to the United States, of starting over in a country that might value her skills without the baggage of her wartime service, and the major was apparently considering whether that could be arranged, whether someone with her knowledge could be useful enough to warrant overlooking her German military service. Morrison wondered what he would do in her position, whether he would try to rebuild in the ruins of his homeland, or seek a fresh start among former enemies, whether he would carry his losses as a burden to be borne, or a motivation to create something better, and he realized he couldn't know, because he'd never lost everything the way these women had. 3 months after the German women arrived at Camp Crossroads, the major organized what he called a demonstration for senior military leadership, a chance to show what the collaboration had produced, and to justify the continuation and expansion of the program, and Morrison found himself assigned to security detail for an event that would bring generals and admirals and government officials to a POW camp in Oklahoma to see weapons technology being explained by enemy prisoners. The centerpiece of the demonstration was a gun that the engineers' team had designed based on their wartime research, but adapted to use American manufacturing capabilities and materials, a hybrid weapon that incorporated German innovations in targeting and German insights into high-altitude engagement, but could be produced with American resources and maintained by American crews. And Morrison had watched the construction over the previous weeks, with fascination at how quickly theory became practice. When adequate resources met genuine expertise, the weapon stood on a concrete pad at the camp's expanded testing range, its barrel angled toward the sky at 45 degrees, its mechanical systems gleaming with fresh paint and oil, its control station surrounded by instruments that monitored everything from barrel temperature to ammunition feed rates to targeting accuracy, and it looked exactly like what it was, a weapon designed by people who understood how to kill effectively and efficiently. The engineer stood beside the gun with Captain Hutchins and the Major, her POW uniform replaced for the day, with civilian clothes that made her look less like a prisoner and more like a technical consultant, and Morrison saw her briefing the assembled officers on the weapon's capabilities, using charts and diagrams to explain how it outperformed existing American anti-aircraft systems in range, accuracy and rate of fire, speaking through Peters with the confidence of someone who knew her subject thoroughly. The demonstration began with a comparison test, an American 90mm anti-aircraft gun firing at target drones at various altitudes, and Morrison watched through binoculars as the conventional weapon managed to hit targets at 10,000 feet, but struggled above 15,000, its shells falling short or drifting wide as the elevation increased beyond its effective range. Then the engineer's weapon fired, and Morrison saw immediately why the German innovations had been so deadly during the war. Shells reaching 20,000 feet with accuracy that made the American gun look primitive by comparison. Target drones exploding in clouds of debris at altitudes where Allied bombers had thought themselves relatively safe, and the assembled officers murmured among themselves as they realized what they were witnessing. The engineer explained through Peters that this represented only a modest application of the principles her team had developed, that the wartime weapons had been even more capable, but had required materials that America's current industrial base couldn't easily provide. But what they were seeing was a compromise between optimal design and practical manufacturing reality, and Morrison saw how she managed to both showcase success and hint at even greater possibilities that might justify continued support for the program. The demonstration continued for 2 hours, testing different scenarios and target profiles, showing how the weapon performed against maneuvering targets and targets at extreme range, demonstrating the rapid-fire capability that could engage multiple bombers in quick succession, proving every claim the engineer had made about German weapons development being more advanced than American intelligence had realized, and by the end, even the most skeptical observers had to acknowledge that this collaboration had produced genuinely valuable results. One general asked the engineer directly whether she had any regrets about sharing this technology with America, whether she felt any loyalty to Germany that might make her hesitant to help America build weapons that could be used against her homeland if another conflict emerged, and her answer was diplomatic but clear. Germany no longer existed as a sovereign nation. The regime she'd served was gone. Her primary loyalty now was to ensuring that the knowledge she'd helped create wasn't lost, and if that meant working with America, she was prepared to do so. Morrison saw several officers nodding at this response, saw them accepting her pragmatic betrayal of national loyalty as reasonable under the circumstances, saw them finding in her words the justification they needed to continue supporting a program that involved giving technical resources to former enemies, and he recognized how easily institutions could rationalize arrangements that served their interests regardless of the moral complexities involved. The Major announced that based on the demonstration's success, he was recommending that the program be expanded, that additional German technical personnel be identified and brought to America, that formal arrangements be made to employ these experts as consultants rather than holding them as prisoners, and that their knowledge be systematically documented before age and death claimed expertise that could be valuable for decades to come. Morrison heard the engineer speaking quietly to Peters after the formal demonstration ended, asking about the status of her emigration application, asking whether her cooperation would translate into permission to bring her son to America once he was released from Soviet custody, asking whether there would be work for her after the immediate military applications had been exhausted, and the young lieutenant promised to follow up with the major about these questions. Though Morrison could see he wasn't confident about the answers, the officers began departing in their staff cars heading back to Washington or Colorado or California or wherever their commands were based, carrying reports and photographs and technical specifications that would influence American weapons development for years to come. And Morrison watched the engineer standing beside her creation, her expression unreadable, her posture showing exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness into something more fundamental, and he wondered what it felt like to have your life's work become a bargaining chip in negotiations between victors who were deciding your fate. Captain Hutchins mentioned later that the demonstration had been deemed a complete success, that funding was being allocated for permanent facilities to house the expanded program, that the engineer was being offered a formal consulting position with generous compensation, and that several other German technical experts had been identified for potential recruitment. And Morrison saw how victory was being transformed into employment, how defeated enemies were becoming valued resource, how the complexities of war were being reduced to simple questions of utility and expertise. 6 months after arriving at Camp Crossroads, the engineer sat in an immigration office in Oklahoma City, filling out forms that would determine whether she could stay in America permanently, whether she could bring her son from Soviet custody once diplomatic arrangements could be made, whether she could build a new life in the country she'd spent years trying to help defeat, and Morrison accompanied her as part of the security detail that still technically guarded her even though she was now working as a paid consultant, rather than being held as a prisoner. The immigration officer was a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Patterson who'd processed thousands of applications over the years, and approached each one with the same methodical attention to detail, and she asked questions about the engineer's background, her education, her family, her wartime activities, her reasons for wanting to emigrate, her plans for supporting herself, her understanding of American laws and customs, all delivered in a tone that suggested she'd heard every possible story and couldn't be swayed by emotion or sympathy. The engineer answered carefully, explaining her engineering credentials, describing her husband's death, and her son's imprisonment and her daughter's death in the bombing raids, acknowledging her service in the Wehrmacht, technical corps, but emphasizing that she'd worked on defensive weapon systems rather than offensive campaigns, expressing hope that America would value her expertise and give her a chance to use her skills for peaceful purposes now that the war was over. Morrison watched Mrs. Patterson's expression remain neutral throughout this recitation, saw her making notes on official forms, saw her occasionally glancing at a thick file that contained the engineer's complete history as documented by military intelligence, and he wondered what that file said, what judgments had been rendered about this woman's wartime service, what recommendations had been made about whether she deserved the privilege of American citizenship. The officer asked about political affiliations, whether the engineer had been a member of the Nazi Party, whether she'd participated in any activities beyond her technical work, whether she'd known about the concentration camps and the systematic murder of millions of people, and Morrison saw the engineer's hands clench in her lap as she answered that she'd been required to join the party to work on military projects, that she'd attended mandatory meetings and paid dues, but hadn't participated in any political activities beyond what was required, that she hadn't known about the death camps until after the surrender, and that she felt profound shame about what had been done in Germany's name, even though she hadn't directly participated in those crimes. Mrs. Patterson's pen scratched across the forms, recording these answers in official language that would become part of a permanent record, and she explained that decisions about immigration for former enemy combatants required approval from multiple agencies, that the engineer's technical value would be weighed against concerns about bringing former Nazi military personnel to America, that there were no guarantees about timeline or outcome, and that patience would be required while the bureaucracy processed her application through its various channels. The engineer asked about her son, whether there was any way to accelerate his release from Soviet custody, whether the American government might use its diplomatic influence to help reunite her family, and Mrs. Patterson's response was carefully non-committal, explaining that Soviet-American relations were complicated, that prisoner exchanges required negotiations at the highest levels, that she couldn't make promises about matters beyond the Immigration Service's control, but that relevant officials would be informed of the family reunification aspect of the application. Morrison saw disappointment flash across the engineer's face before she controlled it, saw her recognize that she was just one applicant among thousands, that her technical value didn't translate into personal priority for the officials who decided such things, that even victory in war didn't give governments the power to easily solve individual problems when those problems involved other sovereign nations and complex diplomatic relationships. The interview continued for another hour, covering financial stability, housing arrangements, employment prospects, language skills, and dozens of other bureaucratic considerations that would determine whether the engineer could legally remain in America. And Morrison found himself hoping the decision would go in her favor, even though he couldn't quite articulate why he cared about the fate of a woman who'd designed weapons to kill American airmen. Captain Hutchins had arranged for the engineer to stay at a boarding house in Oklahoma City while her application was processed, a temporary arrangement that gave her more freedom than a POW camp, but less than full citizenship. And Morrison helped her move the few possessions she'd accumulated during her months in America, technical books she'd been given, clothes she'd purchased with her consulting wages, photographs of her lost family that she kept in a leather folder. She thanked him for his assist speaking in careful English she'd been learning during her time in America, and Morrison replied that he'd just been doing his job, but they both knew something more complicated was happening, that the months of collaboration had created relationships that transcended their official roles, that shared work had built connections even between people whose countries had recently been at war. Peters mentioned later that the engineer had asked him about American universities, whether they would accept a German professor, whether there might be teaching positions available for someone with her credentials and experience, whether academia might offer a path forward that didn't require constant explanation of her wartime service, and the young lieutenant had promised to make inquiry, though he'd warned that many institutions were still hostile to anything German, that anti-Nazi sentiment remained strong in academic circles, that she would face skepticism and hostility no matter what path she chose. Morrison thought about his own future as he drove back to Camp Crossroads, after dropping the engineer at her boarding house, about what he would do when the army released him, about whether he would return to his hometown in Pennsylvania, or try something new, about whether the war had changed him in ways that would make civilian life difficult, and he realized that everyone who'd lived through the conflict was facing similar questions about how to move forward, about how to build lives after being shaped by years of violence and disruption. The major called a meeting of all personnel involved in the technical collaboration program, announcing that the program was being formalized, that facilities were being built specifically for this purpose, that additional German experts were being recruited, and that everyone who'd participated in the initial phase could take pride in having contributed to an operation that was producing genuine intelligence value. And Morrison saw how institutions transformed messy human situations into clean bureaucratic accomplishment, how complexity got simplified into success narratives that could justify continued funding and expansion. The engineer's application would take months to process, maybe years, and during that time she would continue working as a consultant, continue sharing her expertise, continue building a life in America while not quite being part of America. And Morrison understood that this liminal state of being neither prisoner nor citizen was probably how many displaced people were living in the post-war world, waiting for bureaucracies to decide their fates, while trying to construct some kind of normal existence in the meantime.